Hello, white people. All right, we are going to talk about white trash America, and I hope for you guys some light bulbs turn on because a whole lot of light bulbs turned on for me. So I was looking at this book called Hillbilly Elegy. And then the lady who wrote that, or no, it was a different guy, his name's something Vance, he wrote that book. And then there was a suggestion for White Trash America, and I read the reviews on that, and I was like, oh my gosh, I think I just cracked the code here. It's like the secret code of all this white hatred. What is the source of this white hatred? And you know something? It's not actually white hatred. It's hatred of white trash America. You know something? We are the largest voting bloc in America, the largest white group of white people. And the thing is, too, is that, you know, when they bash white people and white men or whatever, they're not talking about the white part of white trash America who thinks they're the elites. Because, you know, these liberals who think that they're elites when they're not, they're just white trash with fancy titles. They're bashing us because they're embarrassed. And I even chased that too because I thought that I could pull myself out of being white trash by going to college and getting a degree and getting a job as a nurse. Ooh, I'm a nurse. I'm so fancy. You know, because I was the only person in my family at the time who went to college and got a degree. And even my sister, my brother went to college, but he went to college later in life. My sister, she never went to college. And one time I was at a family party, and my sister said to me, well, not everybody can have everything handed to them. You got to go to college. I'm like, whoa, let's put the brakes on here. You know why I got to go to college? Because I chose to work 40 to 48 hours a week and pay for myself to go to college. And I didn't sleep through my 20s. And I think I've got, I slept 3 full nights a week. And then I would sleep a couple hours here and there, because I was going to college full-time and I was working full-time and even overtime to pay for that. But my sister thought, that I was just privileged and it was handed to me. She had no idea because she's too young. My sister's several years younger than me and she's still living with our parents when I moved out and got married, and I'm going to college or whatever, and I'm struggling. And every Monday morning, because I would work Sunday at, my last shift would be a 16-hour shift. I'd work 2 o'clock in the afternoon till 6 o'clock in the morning. And then I'd have a class on Monday. So I'd come home and I'd sleep for a couple hours and I'd go to class and I'd cry every Monday. And my husband would say, oh my God, please, no more Monday classes. I can't take the crying anymore. But I was so focused because I did not want to be white trash. I wanted to be somebody. I wanted to be something special. And I was willing to go through all that agony to be something. Because, it's an embarrassment to be, at the time, I was, because I've been brainwashed to believe that being white trash was a bad thing. And now that I'm half century old, white trash is a good thing. You know something? We are good people. White trash, we're a good group of people. And we are the backbone of this country. And these freaking elites and these liberals who are white trash, who are in denial, they hate us. Because, I don't know, have you ever been around anybody who was a recovering drug addict? I used to work in inpatient drug and alcohol rehab. Oh my gosh. And it seems like that place only hired people who were like recovering drug addicts, recovering alcoholics, whatever. And these people would be verbally abusive to the clients. It's like, well, why are you doing that? Because they'd look down their noses and say, well, I used to be there and I hate you, kind of a thing. And so I think you guys will have to tell me what you think. I think that this hatred toward white trash America by these elites is because they know that they're white trash and they're just looking down their nose at us. But anyway, let me get into this article because we're going to be here all day. The breakdown: white trash, the original underclass, waste people, rubbish, clay eaters, hillbillies. Oh, wait a second. I got one more thing to say before I move on to this. You know what? Did I say this before? I don't know if I did or not. But you know how all these elites, these white trash people are phony elites? It's because of easy credit. If it wasn't for easy credit, White trash people, especially the lazy ones, would have no upward mobility. So easy credit gives people a false sense of upward mobility. Is there such a thing as an American dream? I don't know. But anyway, 2 new books that reckon with the long, bleak history of the country's white poor suggest their plight shouldn't have caught the rest of the country off guard. And so now this article is going to go in and talk about politics a little bit, because we are a huge voting bloc, and we're actually the most powerful voting bloc. That's why they hate us so much. They can't manipulate us. Sometime during the past few years, the country started talking differently about white Americans of modest means. Early in the Obama era, the ennobling language of campaign pundits prevailed. There was much discussion of white working-class voters with whom the Democrats and especially Barack Obama were having such trouble connecting. Never mind that this overbroad category of Americans, the exit pollsters' definition was anyone without a 4-year college degree or more than a third of the electorate, obliterated major differences in geography, ethnicity, and culture. The label served to conjure a vast swath of salt-of-the-earth citizens living and working in the wide open spaces between the coasts. Sarah Palin's Real America, who were dubious of the effete, highfalutin types increasingly dominating the party that had once purported to represent the common man, the white working class, connoted virtue and integrity. A party losing touch with it was a party unmoored. That flattering glow has faded away. Today, less privileged white Americans are considered to be in crisis, and the language of sociologists and pathologists predominates. Charles Murray's Coming Apart, The State of White America in 1960 to 2010 was published in 2012, and Robert D. Putnam's Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis came out last year. From opposite ends of the ideological spectrum, they made the case that social breakdown among low-income whites was starting to mimic trends that had begun decades earlier among the affirmative action Americans. Rates of out-of-wedlock births and male joblessness were rising sharply. Then came the stories about a surge in opiate addiction among white Americans, alongside shocking reports of rising mortality rates, including by suicide among the middle-aged whites. And then, of course, came the 2016 presidential campaign. The question was suddenly no longer why Democrats struggled to appeal to regular Americans. It was why so many regular Americans were drawn to a man like Donald Trump. Equally, because these liberal elites, these phony elites, they don't understand. They don't want to be white trash, and they're embarrassed by it. Equally jarring has been the shift in tone. A barely suppressed contempt has characterized much of the commentary about white woe on both the left and the right. Writing for National Review in March, the conservative provocateur Kevin Williamson shoveled scorn on the low-income white Republican voters who, as he saw it, were most responsible for the rise of Trump. Nothing happened to them. There wasn't some awful disaster. There wasn't a war or a famine or a plague or a foreign occupation. Even the economic changes of the past few decades do very little to explain the dysfunction and negligence and the incomprehensible malice of poor white America. So the gypsum business in Garbut ain't what it used to be. There is more to life in the 21st century than wallboard and cheap sentimentality about how the man closed the factories down. The truth about these dysfunctional downscale communities is that they deserve to die. Economically, they are negative assets. Morally, they are indefensible. Forget all your cheap theatrical Bruce Springsteen crap. Forget your sanctimony about struggling Rust Belt factory towns and your conspiracy theories about the wily Orientals stealing our jobs. The white American underclass is enthralled to a vicious self-culture whose main products are misery and used heroin needles. Donald Trump's speeches make them feel good. So does OxyContin. God, these people. Analysis on the left has been less gratuitously nasty but similarly harsh in its insinuation. Several prominent liberals have theorized that what's driving rising mortality and drug and alcohol abuse among white Americans is quite simply a despair over the loss of their perch in the country's pecking order. We're white trash. We're not perched on anything. So what is happening? Asked John Marshall on his Talking Points memo blog in December. Let's put this clearly, he said in wrapping up his analysis of the dismal health data. The stressor at work here is the perceived and real loss of the social and economic advantages of being white. The barely veiled implication, whichever version you considered, is that the people undergoing these travails deserve relatively little sympathy, that they maybe kind of had this reckoning coming. Man, these guys are mean. Either they are layabouts drenched in self-pity, or they are sad cases consumed with racial status anxiety and animus toward the non-whites passing them on the latter. Both interpretations are, in their own ways, strikingly ungenerous toward a huge number of fellow Americans. They are also unsatisfying as explanations for what is happening out there. Williamson, for one, mischaracterizes the typical Trump voter. As exit polls show, the candidate's base is not the truly bereft white underclass Williamson derides. Those Americans are, by and large, not voting at all, as I'm often reminded when reporting in places like Appalachia, where turnout rates are the lowest in the country. People voting for Trump are mostly a notch higher on the economic ladder, in a position to feel exactly the resentment that Williamson himself feels toward the shiftless needy. As for liberals' diagnosis that a major public health crisis is rooted in racial envy, it fails to square with, among other things, the fact that blacks and Hispanics have hardly been flourishing themselves. Yes, there is an African-American president, but by many metrics, the Great Recession was even worse for minorities than for whites. 2 new books, one a provocative, deeply researched history, and the other an affecting memoir. A well-timed to help make better sense of the plight of struggling whites in the United States. Both accounts converge on an important insight. The gloomy state of affairs in the lower reaches of white America should not have caught the rest of the country as off guard as it has, and mobilizing solutions for the crisis will depend partly on closing the gaps that allowed for such obliviousness. Welcome to America as it was. Nancy Eisenberg, a history at Louisiana State University, writes near the outset of White Trash, the 400-year untold history of class in America. Her title might seem sensational were it not so well earned. As she makes plain, a white lower class not only figured more prominently in the development of the colonies and the young country than national lore suggests, but was spoken of from the start explicitly in terms of waste and refuse. For England, the New World beckoned as more than a vast store of natural resources. Eisenberg argues it was also a place to dispose of the dregs of its own society. So basically, we are the descendants of the dregs of English society. In the late 16th century, the geographer Richard Hakluyt argued that America could serve as a giant workhouse where the young children of wandering beggars that grew up idly and hurtfully and burdenous to the realm might be unladen and better bred up. The exportable poor, he wrote, were the offals of our people. In 1619, King James, I was so fed up with the vagrant boys milling around his Newmarket palace that he asked the Virginia Company to ship them overseas. 3 years later, John Donne, yes, that John Donne, wrote about the colony of Virginia as if it were England's spleen and liver. And if you've ever read any John Donne poetry, it's really dramatic, a little bit psycho as far as I'm concerned. Eisenberg writes, draining the ill humors of the body, to breed good blood. Thus it was, she goes on, that the early settlers included so many roguish highwaymen, mean vagrants, Irish rebels, known horrors, and an assortment of convicts, including one Elizabeth Little Bess Armstrong, sent to Virginia for stealing 2 spoons. One of America's founding myths, of course, is that the simple act of leaving England and boldly starting new lives in the colonies had an equalizing effect on the colonists, swiftly narrowing the distance between the indentured servant and merchant, landowner and clerk, all except the African slave. Nonsense, Eisenberg says. The independence did not magically erase the British class system. A ruthless class order was enforced at Jamestown, where one woman returned from 10 months of Indian captivity to be told that she owed 150 pounds of tobacco to her dead husband's former master and would have to work off the debt. The Puritans were likewise obsessed with class rank. Membership in the church and its core elect were elite privileges, not least because the early Massachusetts settlers included far more non-religious riffraff than is generally realized. A version of the North Carolina Constitution, probably co-authored by John Locke, was designed to avoid erecting a numerous democracy. It envisioned a nobility of landgraves and, caciques, German for princes and Spanish for chieftains, along with the court of heraldry. to oversee marriages and make sure they preserved pedigree. Class distinctions were maintained above all in the apportionment of land. In Virginia in 1700, indentured servants had virtually no chance to own any, and by 1770, less than 10% of white Virginians had claim to more than half the land. In 1729, in North Carolina, a colony with 36,000 people, there were only 3,281 listed grants, and 309 grantees owned nearly half the land. Land was the principal source of wealth, and those without any had little chance to escape servitude. Eisenberg writes, "It was the stigma of landlessness that would leave its mark on white trash from this day forward." This was not just a Southern dynamic. The American usage of squatters traces to New England, where many of the non-elect, later called swamp Yankees, carved out homes on others' land only to be chased off and have their houses burned. The Founding Fathers were, as Eisenberg sees it, complicit in perpetuating these stark class divides. George Washington believed that only the lower class of people should serve as foot soldiers in the Continental Army. Thomas Jefferson envisioned his public schools educating talented students raked from the rubbish of the lower class, and argued that ranking humans like animal breeds was perfectly natural. The circumstances of superior beauty is thought worthy of attention in the propagation of our horses, dogs, and other domestic animals, he wrote. Why not that of man? John Adams believed that the passion for distinction was a powerful human force. There must be one, indeed, who is the last and lowest of the human species. By the time the nation gained independence, the white underclass, its future dependents, was fully entrenched. This underclass could be found just about everywhere in the new country, but it was perhaps most conspicuous in North Carolina, where many whites who had been denied land in Virginia trickled into the area south of the Great Dismal Swamp, establishing what Eisenberg calls the first white trash colony. William Byrd II, the Virginia planter, described these swamp denizens as suffering from distempers of laziness and slothful in everything but getting children. North Carolina's governor described his people as the meanest, most rustic, and squalid part of the species. Accounts of this underclass as an anomalous new breed of human, as Eisenberg puts it, proliferated as poor whites without property spread west and south across the country. These crackers and squatters were no better than savages, with children brought up in the woods like brutes, wrote a Swiss-born colonel in the colonial army in 1759. In 1810, the ornithologist Alexander Wilson described the grotesque log cabins where the lowly patriarch typically stood wearing a shirt defiled and torn, also known as the wife-beater, his face inlaid with dirt and soot. Thomas Jefferson's granddaughter came back from an 1817 excursion with her grandfather, telling of that half-civilized race who lived beyond the ridge. In 1830, the country even got its first cracker dictionary to document the slang of poor whites. At various junctures, politicians, think Davy Crockett and Andrew Jackson, turned humble roots into a mark of backwoodsman authenticity. But the pendulum always swings back. The term white trash made its first appearance in print as early as 1821. It gained currency three decades later, by which point observers were expressing horror over these people's tallow skin and their habit of eating clay. I've never heard of people eating clay in the U.S. As George Weston warned in his widely circulated 1856 pamphlet, The Poor Whites of the South, they were sinking deeper and more hopelessly into barbarism with every succeeding generation. Speaking of this class as a separate breed, a species unto itself, was a way to skirt the challenge it presented to the nation's vision of equality and inclusivity. Eisenberg points up the tension. If whiteness was not an automatic badge of superiority, a guarantee of the homogeneous population of independent, educable, free men, then the ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were unobtainable. With so much talk of breeds, it is no surprise that in the early 20th century, the U.S. was gripped by a eugenics craze, which Eisenberg sees as motivated by revulsion over the supposed degeneracy of poor whites, especially those in the South. State fairs held fitter family contests. Teddy Roosevelt fretted about Americans' germ protoplasm, and Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. issued a ruling upholding the forced sterilization of a poor Virginian named Carrie Buck, deemed a moron. Now, back then, people who were mentally retarded or mentally delayed or whatever, they were called morons or idiots. It's not used in the same context today. Eisenberg, for all her efforts to clarify the role of class in the national culture, succumbs to a different kind of distortion herself. She is frustratingly hazy about regional distinctions within the white lower class, a blurriness that also skews some of the contemporary liberal theorizing about white despondency. As her account progresses, she focuses increasingly on the South without squarely addressing that choice and its implications. To zero in on the white underclass in or near slaveholding areas is, understandably, to dwell on the fraught dynamic between poor whites and enslaved affirmative action Americans and its role in the national debate leading up to the Civil War. On the one hand, opponents of slavery argued that the association of labor with servitude dulled the work ethic of poor whites. On the other, defenders of slavery claimed that being sparred the lowliest toil kept poor Southern whites a step above their Northern counterparts. But there were whole other swaths of the country where many poor whites lived without any blacks nearby to speak of, not least the broad expanse of Appalachia. Eisenberg makes plain in a brief aside that she does not buy the idea enshrined in so many books in recent years of a separate cohort of Scots-Irish, hard-drinking, hard-scrapping brawlers from the borderlands of Scotland and Northern Ireland and Northern England who, cherishing their freedom and wanting nothing to do with the coastal elites, set up in the Appalachian Hills in the mid-18th century. One such account, Grady McWhiney's Cracker Culture, 1988, earns Eisenberg's brisk dismissal as a flawed historical study that turned poor whites into Celtic ethnics, Scots-Irish. Regardless of the merits in that dispute, Eisenberg ought to have reckoned more fully with the distinctions between poor whites in the Deep South and those elsewhere. At points she mentions hillbilly whites, aka mountaineers and briar hoppers, as a subset of her white underclass, but at other points she makes it sound as if all poor whites lived with blacks in their midst, and when the Civil War came, went off with varying degrees of enthusiasm to fight to maintain their superiority over those blacks. In reality, many poor whites in Appalachia avoided what they saw as the war of the slave-holding planters of the Deep South and the Cavaliers of the Tidewater region of Virginia, and even created a new state, West Virginia, in their resistance. Whether or not one buys into the Scots-Irish version of events, the history of Greater Appalachia is one of provincial upstarts asserting themselves against elites, not merely one of dispossessed victims. The distinction's relevance persists today. Large areas of real America are almost entirely white. And, you know something? I'm out here just on the outskirts of Appalachia, and I tell people all the time I had to move back to America. Kind of weird. I guess I was right. In Appalachia, that homogeneity, along with the region's populist tradition, helps explain why white voters there took so much longer to flip from Democrat to Republican than in the Deep South. This does not mean that racism is absent in these areas. Far from it. But it suggests that racism is fueled as much by suspicion of the other as it is by first-hand experience of blacks in competition with them, and that political sentiment on issues such as welfare and crime isn't as racially motivated as many liberal analysts assume. A focus in the South also eclipses places where low-income whites consist mainly of descendants of later European immigrants. Think of the South Boston Irish or Baltimore's Polish-American dockworkers depicted in the second season of The Wire. As Eisenberg's chronicle moves into the middle of the 20th century, she offers a fascinating account of how the trailer parks built to provide housing for war industry workers gave rise to a whole new demeaning stereotype, trailer trash. She captures the reflexively pejorative depictions of poor Southern whites during the Civil Rights era, as she shows how, starting in the 1970s, the new preoccupation with ethnic heritage instilled a semi-ironic pride in redneck identity. The upgraded self-image prefigured the elevation of the white working class in the years to follow. By the time her account reaches the late 20th century, though, the social and economic texture thins. Instead, Eisenberg resorts to cataloging representations of poor whites in pop culture. Deliverance, Hee Haw, Here Comes Honey Boo Boo, and celebrity politics, Tammy Faye Baker, Bill Clinton, Sarah Palin, and offers some fairly trite commentary on the current political scene. Eisenberg's history is a bracing reminder of the persistent contempt for the white underclass, but you will have to look elsewhere for insights into why the condition of this class has taken a turn for the worse and what its members think of themselves and of the elites who have trashed them for so long. All right, so I'm going to stop here because the next little bit is about the book called Hillbilly Elegy. And I'm sure this video is already long enough. But anyway, so let me know if you guys had any lights turn on, if there's any sort of a realization, or if you've come to maybe you came to the conclusion before I did that this is not attack. When they bash white people, it's not just that they're bashing white people. They're bashing white trash people, us, because we are the strongest political group in America, and it pisses them off and they can't control us. All right, white people, that's the damage for now. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to your thoughts below.